So now we will turn it over to questions from the committee. So starting off with Anna, if you would like to go first, and then Alex next.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate the comments today, and in some ways they're very encouraging, I think. I don't know. I guess we'll be talking about that as we go forward. So my question is for Ms. Calais. I apologize if I've not said your name correctly. But my question has to do with whether you've ever had a claim involving, to your knowledge, have you ever had a claim involving pregnant or lactating persons who were injured during the course of a clinical trial, or maybe even injured in clinical practice to the extent that your work encompasses that area as well?
I'm not acutely aware of specific details, but I mean, yes, we do a lot of research across the system, and yes, there have been even lawsuits, right, alleging complications arising from participation in research. It could be often that, often the issue would be, an informed consent issue. I was not fully made aware of the risks when participating in the study. They're often what we could and what we have seen in this space. And
is the approach then to settle? Is that you come?
I'm not involved, but it would certainly depend on the case, depend upon, was it sponsor initiated, was it research, and to what extent were we involved in the design of the study? Right, there could be a multitude of factors that would, in any case, right, determine, what path is taken.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Alex. And then Mimi, you're next.
My question is one that goes across the presentation by Ms. Dyson and Ms. Hurley. To what extent do you have experience, do either of you have experience with the approval process being affected by whether or not there is insurance involved? And the impression that I got from the Ms. Calais' presentation is that the commercial sponsors are typically expected to provide insurance, but that research that is either federally sponsored or would be paid from within university resources or other research institutions may typically take advantage of the requirements under the regulations that allow a statement that there will be no compensation. Immediate care will be provided to try to halt or remedy whatever thing has happened, but the kinds of things we're talking about are not usually emergency situations in the research. It's some consequence that shows up particularly after birth or during lactation with a child. And so I wonder, I guess I could start with Alyssa Hurley to ask whether in the studies of IRBs that you have conducted and asked them questions, is the sense that they're approving research and then telling people, but you're going to be on your own if harm occurs? Is that a consequence? Does that affect IRB's conservatism, as you described it, to allow participants in this category? And then whether you have any experience that differs from that, Ms. Dyson, about the willingness if you're saying we're going to fully compensate.
Thanks, Alex. And I will not pretend to be an expert on sort of what's happening in sort of IRB office communications with other parts of the Human Research Protection Program or the institution, but I do, I think these insurance questions, right, they're dealt with outside the IRB, and there are policies at the institutional level about what we do in terms of compensation for injury or what we, tell people about insurance, I don't get the sense that that is making a difference to whether, we have an institutional policy where we don't, where we say, sure, we'll cover if there's emergency care needed, but sort of that's it, that on its own would make an IRB less likely to want to approve a study where there's some possibility of something going wrong with a pregnant woman. I think there's an understanding on IRBs. This is our institutional policy. All of our consent forms say the same thing, right, about compensation for injury or treatment in emergencies or what insurance may and may not cover. And I'm not sure that factors into the particular way IRBs would look at studies on these populations.
So I would say that the vast majority of my experience is with manufacturer sponsors.
Sarah, I'm sorry, do you mind turning on your mic?
Oh, yes. I'm sorry. We also will insure non-manufacturer sponsors. So not all universities conduct studies the same. We do have several universities who are insured, and we insure their clinical trial programs. So the policy covers two things. It covers, there's a med pay provision. It's a no-fault provision. We don't look into why the person needs medical care, but up to a sublimit, we take care of any sort of hospitalization or medical care that results as the immediate treatment for the trial. The second thing we cover, which is really more expensive and probably to your point, are those long-term, somebody's been injured, 20 years from now, a child, now an adult, realizes that there's been a problem. There is a federal rule in the federal regs, and I believe it's based on an international rule, that you, the sponsor, cannot ask a clinical trial participant to waive liability. So they are very able, under the law, they can come back to the manufacturer of the product under a product's liability theory, and if there's a case, reach a settlement. That's what we insure as well. You mentioned, I don't think it is possible for manufacturer sponsors, so different than DOD or NIH or some government entity that's sponsoring a clinical trial. But a private company really cannot conduct a trial without insurance because there is a web of contracts that surround the making of the product through the supply chain, through the distribution chain, with the CRO, with the trial site, just a web of contracts. And they all require the sponsor to carry products liability insurance. So it's, as a practical matter, you really can't conduct a trial without insurance.
Okay, thank you very much. Mimi, you're next, and then Ifenwa, you'll be next.
So I want to thank all three of you. It was really helpful. The one I know the least about is insurance, so I'm focusing in on Ms. Dyson. You dangled the vaccine model. Mm-hmm. Tell us about it.
Okay, so this one's interesting, and I do have a slide on. I keep pushing my slides because I really hope you look at them. I tried to put some interesting things in there for you. But there was a time when companies stopped making vaccines, and it was because of liability. They just couldn't make that model work for themselves. And this turned into a public health crisis. So the solution was to create a vaccine court, which is still in existence today, right? It's run in part through FDA. And the idea is that if you're injured by a vaccine, you can make a case in federal court. The rules of civil procedure are slightly different than they are for our usual liability. And you can possibly, if you can make your case, receive damages for whatever occurred to you. So this made it safe for vaccine manufacturers to go ahead and begin making vaccines again. Now, I will tell you, because these vaccine manufacturers are also our clients, they do buy insurance because we help with defense costs and we help with risk management. And again, there's all of those contract provisions that you have to fulfill. So they still buy insurance, but the risk looks completely different to me as an underwriter, knowing that that there is a vaccine court that makes this a little bit safer. It's not going to be the sort of wild west of litigation that existed prior to the vaccine courts, where settlements were huge and they were just not economically feasible. So that's an interesting model. I think that some of you have ties to FDA, or I tried to read everybody's bio. That might be one that you could readily get information about and how they work that. And if you could have women who are pregnant have some sort of vaccine court, right, the equivalent of, that's very appealing to me as an underwriter. It does change the risk. There are other things you could do. Liability shields. So think about the products that came to market during the pandemic through EUAs. There's a liability shield. Now, those companies all buy insurance, but it's a much safer risk. I don't want to take up too much time, but there's other alternative things you could do from a legislative standpoint that make me as an underwriter very interested in your product.
Okay, thank you. Ifenwa, you're next, and then Bronwyn, you're after Ifenwa.
Hi, thank you to all the speakers. My questions are for Ms. Calais and Ms. Hurley. Thank you, everyone, for your presentations. Ms. Calais, regarding the different type of funded related projects you had mentioned or separated, industry-sponsored research versus investigator-initiated research. And I'm just curious, based on your experiences, are there differences in which type of sponsored researchers are engaging in research or including pregnant and lactating people in their studies based on the different types of liability that you shared, right? In terms of industry sponsored, it's liability-wise covers everything, whereas at least in the UC system, investigator sponsored studies are really only, the UC is really only responsible for the treatment. So I'm curious in terms of, do you see differences in the engagement and the inclusion of pregnant and lactating people along those lines related to liability? And then I also had a follow-up question regarding the Dobbs decision, but I'll hold that until you answer the first question.
So that's a great question. And honestly, I do not know the answer, but now I am very curious to find out. If, to the extent we can track it, often it's a tracking issue. We probably don't even know the answer, but I think it would be a critically important thing to know. Does that affect the inclination for, us to see, the actual occurrence, right? And I think this is something you could do federally, like look at maybe even, clinicaltrials.gov, like to what extent are there studies involving, and I would think it's very much, could be market driven, right, by industry. But I think that would be something that would be interesting to look at. And you could do clinicaltrials.gov and identify what, does it swing one way or the other in terms of being more likely to be funded by industry or sponsored by industry?
Thank you for that. And then regarding the Dobbs decision, I greatly appreciated you bringing up some of the legal ramifications that could occur if pregnant and lactating people engage in certain research activity and clinical research activity. I'm curious in terms of, in addition to the certificates of confidentiality, what other safeguards or resources could researchers engage in that would be protective of both the pregnant and lactating persons, in addition to the research, the institutions or the companies engaging in that research?
Mm-hmm. So that's a really great question, and something I've been thinking about a lot. So obviously, certificate of confidentiality, if you're not, you could seek one if you don't automatically, get one under NIH. Another couple, options, but there's a concern, right, that they do not cover reliance, right, registries. So in California, we actually have a new law passed by AB 2091 that prohibits the disclosure of medical information. That's basically what's PHI under the state law equivalent. Medical information of individuals who are seeking or obtaining abortion services when the request is related to maybe it's a foreign subpoena or some sort of foreign or non-California law that would, implicate or, their activities. So it directly that law directly applies to medical providers. However, there is, where the researcher is receiving effectively protected health information for conducting the study, they are prohibited also from disclosing that information in response due to this California law in response to any subpoena or request. Of course, this law could be challenged. We'll have to see what happens. It just passed, so it's very new. The other thing that I've been advising our researchers, obviously, is don't collect identifiable information. If you're looking at at the medical records, collect, de-identify the data at the outset of collection so that you don't know, and you are adding that element of protection to the participants.
Thank you. And then my one question for Ms. Hurley. Regarding, at the outset, you had mentioned that IRBs are relatively conservative in the inclusion of pregnant and lactating people. I'm just curious in terms of, in addition to more or continued education regarding the importance of this, what other type of anticipatory guidance do you see or would you recommend for IRBs, for institutions, and also for researchers regarding the justification and inclusion of pregnant and lactating people in their projects?
Yeah, so I do want to say, I think education and training for IRBs, especially on sort of risk assessment, right, I think is critical. I think guidance, whether from, one's always a little hesitant about, do we want more guidance from the regulators? But I think in this case, guidance about Subpart B interpretation and more guidance on the minimal risk standard, whether that's from the regulators, which I think could be helpful, but also in the form of institutions. I think, institutions creating in their policies sort of checklists or decision charts, that can help people navigate and ask the questions of understand sort of the interpretations of Subpart B or get clear on Subpart B, I think would be helpful. This is less guidance, but I think having maternal fetal medicine specialists, obstetricians as members of IRBs, even if the research, this is not an institution that's focused on pregnancy research, but having them on IRBs so they can ask the questions, well, we're pregnant, why are pregnant women excluded here, right? Would actually be really, really useful, and then be able to talk intelligently about what the risks are of not doing it. So I think that's really, is really key. And yeah, absolutely. I think that, the science, like you said, the science, understanding the science and the risks of not doing this research, just more sort of training, I think, on that. And I think the last thing I would just say is, there are examples. I think the University of Washington is one where they have a big sort of, I think it's fair to say, as a human research protection program, they changed the default to the presumption is inclusion, right? And that starts at the sort of top, and I'm sure there's also insurance, is part of that conversation. In terms of, there are policies and procedures written that express an institutional commitment to, this is important, we think this is important here. And that trickles down to, so for investigators, that means you have to justify exclusion. And that means IRBs, you get to ask, why are pregnant women excluded, right? So that's the research we do here. Here's what that means for the review process. Our policies and procedures, sort of reflect that. So I think, so when I said at the end of my sort of presentation, IRBs, I think, in a position to be helpful allies here, I think they need a structure from an institution behind them that says, this is what we do, and then this is how we think about this here, this is what we do, and then that filters to sort of all the parts of the research enterprise at the institution.
Thank you. So moving on, the next question is from Bronson.
Hi, thank you. Really excellent talks to tee up this discussion. I really appreciate it. I was wondering with regards to, and this is, I guess, open, even though I know there are different perspectives that are presented, but it came up when we were talking about the UC claims for Ms. Kylie, that my question was that with the claims and lawsuits that have arisen in your experience, is it that there are disproportionate, like that among pregnant and lactating participants, that the share of claims or lawsuits are disproportionate? Because I imagine that you see them come in from all kinds of study participants. Or is it that something about the severity, like the cost of the claims? I was sort of thinking through that like volume versus severity piece as we think about risk and how it's perceived. Because when you know, of course you've had pregnant and lactating persons who've had claims, but is it so much more so than any other sort of group or population that might participate in research? I'm trying to get a handle on that. Or, you know, are we kind of back to this sort of opening commentary about, is it really about, you know, the fetus or the biology or something else that people are really kind of worried about? So can you talk to me about risk from that standpoint? I do have one follow-up, but it has to do with after that last comment about whether that new law will have implications for data use agreements for collaborators trying to do research outside of the state of California. But I'll come back to that one.
Okay. As far as you guys are asking, you're asking wonderful questions that honestly, I don't know. I wouldn't think that it would be disproportionate because there are a host of reasons why someone would bring a claim. And most likely I would not think that, right? We're not doing a significant number of these studies. We are studying pregnant and lactating women, but so I can't think that they would be disproportionate, but it'd be something interesting for us to look at and evaluate. I am not involved in the litigation, so I don't know, but I have not heard anything that would make me think something disproportionate number.
Yeah, so I will say that this is a great question, and we frame this as the frequency versus severity question. That's what you're asking. Is it bad risk because it's frequent, or is it because it's severe? And I can tell you solidly because it's severe. We don't see as a carrier a ton of these claims because we underwrite them out, because women aren't persons are not who are pregnant or lactating are not being included. So it's not at all a frequency issue. The problem is that it's a sure loser. Remember I talked about the betting. It's a bad bet. And the reason for that is the juries are very, very punishing to companies that injure pregnant or lactating women or children. So you don't even try these cases. You simply get out your checkbook and you write a check, and you don't have a fighting chance against them. And that's why carriers don't like them.
Okay, thank you. Amy, you're next. Oh, you had yours. Okay, Cece, you're next.
So thanks. So I'm Cece Lee. I'm a pediatrician, and so I'm kind of asking a question from the perspective of a principal investigator who does trials in pregnant women and lactating women, and has been shopping for medical trial insurance and also accepting risk of that. And so part of my question is we recently were struggling with getting our institution to accept a grant to do a trial in pregnant women. We were providing a drug that's actually not, this is azithromycin, not high risk. It had actually is commonly given a common dose. But our institution was not kind of willing to accept that the clinical trial insurance was enough. There was certainly the minor claims of, injury, mild side effects that was fine, but it was the risk of the potential future risk of litigation and lawsuits that was of concern, as well as the tail. And I'd like for you to comment a little more on the tail.
Okay.
This was maybe 6 or 7 years ago, and this was an investigated, not industry-sponsored trial. And, we had limited funding for a certain period, and the trial insurance would only cover a tail for a certain number of years that the institution wasn't thrilled with. And then also raised points about the risk to the offspring and then future offspring of the offspring. And so this, it was just overall very challenging. And so I'd love to hear about that, some of that perspective from the insurance side.
So you've asked me a very complicated question. As far as the tail is concerned, so a tail is really about latent risk. So as an underwriter, I would rather insure a clinical trial that is about a device, because you tend to know of an injury right away, or at least shortly thereafter, whereas a drug has a great deal of latency, and that can pop up decades later. So that's what, when we talk about tail, that's what we're referring to. So first of all, in contracts, you can negotiate the length of your tail. Now, you're probably never going to get a 20-year tail or a 30-year tail. It would be cost prohibitive, and you would rather just fund that risk. But that is a concern for pharmaceutical trials. I would say you can negotiate that. But interestingly, you as the principal investigator need to be covered under a med-mal policy. You're not going to be hit with the product's liability, the product's liability case. That's still going to go to the manufacturer, even if the manufacturer has nothing to do with the trial. Now, they have defenses, right? They'd say the doctor, the principal investigator, should not have used this drug in this way. They will fight you back. But the product's liability cause of action belongs to the manufacturer of the product. You would be on the hook for med-mal. So you would want a healthcare professional liability policy. Many of those policies, until recently, have excluded principal investigators working in clinical trials. So you really, it makes non-manufacturer sponsored trials a bit risky, right? Because you don't have a partner there. There's things that you can do, though, to make your risk more attractive to a carrier. So I actually have a list of things that I would advise a company to do if they want to make their trial more attractive. And you could go to the carrier and say, look, I've done all of these things, and try to work through your insurance contract that way. These are very expensive insurance policies that are subject to negotiation. It's not like going on the auto website and putting in your info and having, so there is room. These are contracts that can be negotiated. But I would say, you want to demonstrate a concern for the potential risks, show that you theorized what risks could occur to a pregnant person. You would want to conduct significant bench testing before putting that product to trial, perhaps more information regarding what happens to pregnant persons or lactating persons. You would want to conduct informed consent on video so that you could later prove, look, we had a real interaction with the subject who acknowledged these risks and agreed to go forward. You would want to ensure compensation is reasonable. You would never want to make this look like an offer someone couldn't refuse, right? You would want to make sure that it's not coercion to get the person to participate in the trial. You would want to consult with a reputable IRB. And in fact, I would encourage you to go to multiple IRBs. That's not required under the law, but just to get ethical opinions about including this vulnerable population in your trial. And then you would want to select a trial site. This is a little bit different for you because you are the trial site, but if you're the manufacturer of the product, you would want to select a trial site that has a specialty in high-risk pregnancy. So there's certain risk management things you can do to design a trial that is more friendly for pregnant persons or lactating persons. It's just that I don't think trials really get that far, right? Because they've already decided they're not going to do it. So they don't need to bring these mitigation measures into play. Does that answer your question? Okay.
Sarah, if I could just follow up on this question of the tail. From the standpoint of the manufacturer conducting the clinical trials, because some of these risks may emerge many years down the path, how long would they have to track the patients and the offspring in order to put something in a label?
So I think that is going to be decided, number one, based on what it is that you're testing, right? What you already know about that product. Certain products chemically disappear, right? I'm speaking to a group who have a much better science background than I do. But you know what products over time need to be tracked because they have long-term implications and which don't. I think secondly, the FDA is going to weigh in on that and tell you, here's what the trial design needs to look like. Or they may even order that phase 4 trial, right, where it's an extended period of time, it's people who've had the drugs. So I think it's unique to the circumstances. As an insurance carrier, we look to you, the experts, the companies that are making these, the scientists to tell us, and we're happy to conform the policy, assuming the risk is otherwise safe, to the needs that you would have. But that's a question that needs to be answered in sort of the design phase by the maker of the product.
Okay, thank you. Ahiza.
Thank you very much. My question goes to Ms. Hurley. Thanks for bringing up some of these issues that relate to IRBs and how they interpret some of the statutes, like the FDA statutes and all that, and move more towards exclusion than inclusion. And yes, I agree that having a maternal-fetal medicine on these IRBs kind of helps a lot. I can say that for sure because I've been on some of the study sections and IRBs. But I know that you guys have these annual primer conferences for IRBs and human subjects research that you do annually. I just wanted to find out who attends these conferences. Is it, in terms of which persons attend the conferences, is it something that is broadly attended by institutions across the U.S.? And are these issues brought up at this conference, and how are they addressed, and what is the reception like? Is there pushback on how to unify some of these issues that you raised today at your conferences?
Yes, thank you so much for your question. So yes, the audience is national and even international, and in terms of stakeholders in the enterprise represented there, while I'd say the largest group is typically IRB professional staff and administrators, followed by those who sit on IRBs as members and chairs. But certainly, to the extent some of those people also, of course, wear a researcher hat, but also sort of researchers and people who sit in other areas of compliance and legal personnel at institutions and such. So it's a pretty broad, and we're certainly aiming to broaden the stakeholders in the enterprise, since after all, it is a broad enterprise with so many stakeholders that are attending. To the extent that we've addressed these issues, the primer conferences, just to sort of lay the landscape a little bit, are always this sort of mix of pretty operational, sort of how do I run my IRB office and how do we do our SOPs and things like that, and higher level, intentionally higher level sort of conceptual or policy issues, right? And so, we've had sessions that are about the sort of, thankfully, problem of lack of inclusion of pregnant women in research, and I think they're well received in theory. I think in principle people would agree, right? I think where the rubber meets the road is what practices say on the ground and what is, what's happening, what the reality sort of is on the ground. So I think the work that we could do is continuing to connect the scientific reasons, the justice reasons, the equity reasons, right? To do this with, okay, what has to happen then for IRBs to sort of be important partners in that. So I think, so I think that's where we can think about some more work at the conferences to do that, because I do think that's the place to do it, since we have the ear of a huge portion of the IRB community. Does that sort of answer your question?
Thank you very
Yes.
much. And Leslie, I think you have the last question.
Thank you all for your comments. My question, or questions, because they're for two different people, are related to the Supreme Court's decision in Dobbs. So in the first 100 days after the Supreme Court's decision in that case, 16 states passed near total bans on abortion. And I'm wondering, in light of that, this is the first question for Ms. Dyson, whether insurance companies are thinking about access to abortion in their assessment of clinical trial risk. In other words, are insurance companies perhaps less likely to insure research in states that don't permit abortion, or perhaps feel more comfortable insuring that research in states that do allow abortion in at least some circumstances?
So we are more interested in the product itself, in what it's used for, because it's not just about where the clinical trial takes place, but the eventual commercialization. So the official instruction that we have to our underwriters at this point is, if you find a product that is really used for that medical purpose, it requires special attention and oversight. We spend a lot of time researching it. We do not consider where the clinical trial is being performed itself at this time. I don't know that maybe we should, but that's not something we're actively doing.
Thank you. That's helpful. And the second question is for Ms. Hurley. I'm wondering, again, in light of the Dobbs decision, whether you're seeing any indication that investigators are forum shopping for research or to get IRB approval for research involving pregnant people. In other words, whether they're perhaps using the new single IRB rule to navigate around seeking IRB approvals in states that have severe abortion restrictions?
Yeah, you know what, I'm just not aware. I could definitely look into that. You know, I know there have been some challenges with when you have, right, some of these IRBs, they're multi-state, multi-site trials, right, and you have laws that might be wildly different across states. It's proving a real challenge, but it's a really good question, Leslie. I would have to look into a little bit, and I could do that and get back to you to see if anybody has some info.
Thank you, that would be terrific.
Could I just ask here, I thought Leslie was asking not about research on abortifacients, but rather research that might expose a fetus to potential harm. And if during the trial, a physician became aware from other reports that a patient to whom he had given an investigational drug was now at that point of having a risk, if she were in a state that did or didn't allow an abortion, her decision as to whether or not to carry the pregnancy to term in light of the new information would be different. And if she carried to term and had a bad outcome and you insured her, that would be a bigger risk to the insurance company. Did I understand your question correctly?
That was exactly the question. Mm-hmm.
So let me say that, and this is, I run the risk of sounding very callous here, but please understand, as a practical matter, the way the liability flows, we are now outside of products liability, because now you're out of the protocol. You're now into medical decisions. I don't know that you get all the way back to the product itself. You know, it's not something that would necessarily come into the underwriting process for that reason.
Well, I mean, the thought process, I gather, was if I've insured your product's trial and something begins to indicate that there is a big risk here, if all of the people to whom it was given were in a state where they couldn't have an abortion, all of those babies are going to be born. And if this is a lifetime burden, and et cetera, that's that long period of payout. I mean,
yeah, the tail.
Yes. Versus a situation in which many of those women, out of concern for their fetus and the burdens, if they were in a state where they could have an abortion, would choose to abort, and that liability disappears for you. You know, they may have some pain and suffering issues and so forth because of their loss, but it's a totally different picture dollar-wise. You're saying that those differences are not now taken into consideration in deciding where you would say, we will insure this trial in California, but not in Texas or not in Alabama or wherever.
So I understand the theory of what you're saying. However, as a practical matter, we don't get there because we don't see a lot of trials that involve pregnant women. We look, if there are, we look at how they will be handled. We are deferring to the physician for the medical judgment. It's just not something that we're underwriting for at this time. It seems tenuous and not, while the theory works, you're not going to have that concentration that you described. It's just not something that we can research or know. So it's not, I can't burn my underwriter's time investigating something that I think is unknowable for us and is a tenuous risk. I'd rather have their attention faced elsewhere. I'm giving you a practical answer to your question, and I respect your question, but it's just not how we're thinking of the risk.
Okay. Well, I want to thank our three speakers for three very informative talks and answering all our questions so thoroughly. Thank you very much, and that closes the session.